Stevens was in demand. He toured with an unlikely all-star lineup that included romantic crooner Engelbert Humperdinck and rock revolutionary Jimi Hendrix.
Engelbert Humperdinck, he'd teach me how to drink port and brandy.
Better bring another bottle with you, baby.
Other substances, I suppose, which I learnt maybe from Jimi Hendrix and that crowd. That was a very, very, I would say taxing period on my health.
And it was taxing on his relationship with Mike Hurst. Streetwise Stevens was becoming his own man.
Perhaps lost a bit of my innocence very early on, but I never lost my conscience, and I think that was perhaps a very important point to my whole life, is that I was always protective of my soul, and I never really sold out to anybody.
Cat was running himself ragged, touring, recording, and writing around the clock. His health suffered from the relentless pace. Exhausted, Cat sought medical advice. In March of '68, he was diagnosed with a potentially fatal disease, tuberculosis.
The doctor that actually discovered that he had TB said to him that, you only had a couple of weeks of life left in you. You would have been dead.
The frightened 21-year-old was rushed to King Edward VII Hospital outside London. Forced to rest, he began to contemplate the path he was on.
Trouble, oh, trouble, move from me.
I really didn't want to leave this world without knowing where I was going. And that was where I started my search, looking into the self, trying to find that place of peace where nobody could bother you, not even death itself.
And so my mind begins to memorize, 'cause time will never seem the same.
The reluctant pop star was finally able to take stock of the wild ride he'd been on for the past 2 years.
He started to think about the future. He wasn't that happy with himself at that stage. Cat Stevens, in a sense, hadn't really been born in the true sense.
Left alone in his hospital room, he could finally follow his heart, a soul-searching trek that would lead to some of the most introspective songs of a generation. But the more adulation the star received, the more he withdrew. Like many in his generation, Cat was seeking answers to his growing sense of spiritual emptiness. He explored Eastern religions and New Age philosophies, topics he'd been interested in for years.
My search was going on at the same time as I was playing, 40,000 seaters in Houston, and that kind of paradox was with me. In a way, throughout my life, I had this kind of, this ability to kind of cross thresholds.
Keen to step out of the mainstream, he left England and his usual studio team to record an album in Jamaica with session musicians. Released in July of '73, the aptly titled Foreigner sold well of his trip. Upon his return from Africa, a wandering Cat Stevens went back into the studio. Reunited with Paul Samwell Smith and guitarist Alan Davies, he recorded an album with a more familiar sound, but the title reflected a man increasingly torn between two worlds.
I was traveling on some plane to a gig, and I had my little sort of icon, sort of Buddha statue thing, which I used to carry around with me, and I had a chocolate box in the other hand, so I said, look at that, And if I was to die in this plane, where would I be between the material and the spiritual?
Oh no, don't say those same idle lies.
Cat Stevens was more than a big star. He was a big business. And after recording and touring non-stop for nearly 5 years, he was exhausted.
I'm sure I was pretty difficult to be with sometimes because, I was looking for my identity and I was a chameleon.
In his constant quest for answers, Cat latched on to another philosophy, numerology, which seeks to explain the mysteries of the universe through mathematics.
Why was I born a nine, cursed repeatedly?
The experience inspired the ambitious concept album he called Numbers. Released in October 1975, it sold quite well, but was far from radio-friendly, and record executives were left wondering where all the hits had gone.
Who would know if I should die? No one needed me.
At one time, Jerry Moss said it just sounds as if he's finding much more difficulty getting a song out you know, because there'd be all kind of arrangements and complications, and then even the album graphics, everything became much more complicated.
In 1975, just before he was to undertake another major tour, an anxious Cat Stevens visited Jerry Moss at his home in Malibu.
I think we were hoping it was going to be a nicer day, you know, and somehow it didn't turn out that way. It was pretty much like this kind of day.
With his hosts inside preparing for lunch, Cat decided to go swimming. But just as he swam beyond the surf, he was caught in a current and pulled out to sea.
Suddenly I realized that I was fighting the ocean, and the tide was going that way, and I wasn't getting any closer. The fear of death struck me, and I suddenly held myself and I said, "Oh God, if you save me, I'll work for you." And at that moment, a wave pushed me forward, and suddenly I was swimming back with all the energy that I needed, and I was back on land. And I thank God.
On that fateful day, Cat Stevens made a solemn promise that he would repay God for sparing his life, but he had no idea how he'd fulfill it.
I was just grateful to still be here, because I was a lover of life, you know, and I still hadn't worked it out. And now I was given a chance, second chance.
For nearly a year, he waited for a sign. It came in the form of a gift from his brother David.
He just traveled to Jerusalem, and I suppose it was a mini sort of spiritual journey for him. But it's amazing that he discovered another religion.
I kind of almost tripped into it by going to the Dome on the Rock, which is the mosque there. I gave my brother the Quran because I felt there was something very special in the religion of Islam. He sat there and he read this thing, and he doesn't do anything lightheartedly.
And what he discovered in the Quran is a faith that he says is more familiar than foreign. Cat was learning that, like Christians and Jews, Muslims worship the one God of Abraham.
When I first started reading the Quran, it wasn't a sudden, you know, bursting light. It wasn't like that. But it was, in a way, an immediate revelation that the first name that I read in the Quran was God's name. You know, I never knew that Muslims believed in God. One of the things that really surprised me, which made me feel very at home, was finding the names of all the prophets that I've read in the Bible.
For the next year, Cat Stevens privately studied the Quran. Unlike his earlier explorations, this spiritual journey was one he seemed intent on completing.
To me, it was just a new awakening. And things which I've been writing about, you know, come on now, it's freedom calling, come on over and find yourself. You know, I was now saying to myself, well, perhaps I'm being confronted with something that I didn't expect to find in my lifetime. You know, possibly the truth.
Cat Stevens was a man in the midst of profound change when he set out on the tour he called Magic Hat in November 1975. Inspired by the Quran, Cat Stevens was gradually moving toward the Islamic faith. In early 1977, his spiritual journey continued when he traveled to Jerusalem.